All right, hello there, folks. I am Victoria Tredo, and I will be presenting for my partner Trevor McCowiak as well. But many climate change denialists claim that CO2 is a minuscule trace gas that has no effect on Earth's climate. But what I'm here to do is explain the science behind why they're wrong, motives behind the perpetuation of this claim, and how we can help to terminate the spread of this incorrect claim. So first, let's get into the science. So atmospheric CO2 concentrations right now are higher than ever recorded. So they're over the last 800,000 years. This is a nice graph showing the increase right now, and we're at about in 2021 420 ppm. But CO2 concentrations fluctuate over time between glacial and interglacial warm periods. During glacial periods, CO2 is stored deep in ocean circulation, and during warm periods, CO2 is in the atmosphere. So CO2 cycling on Earth is balanced, usually before human input. We didn't take this into account. Nature didn't take this into account when trying to regulate everything. So CO2 concentrations today, again, are higher than ever before. A lot of sources of CO2 are respiration from plants, but anthropogenic CO2 is largely from the burning of fossil fuels. So 34 billion metric tons of CO2 were released last year from fossil fuels, and 0.5 billion metric tons are from volcanoes. So that kind of disparity, 34 billion because of humans and 0.5 billion because of volcanoes. You can see who's really causing the higher concentrations in the atmosphere. And CO2 is a greenhouse gas. So incoming infrared radiation from the sun hits CO2 and causes the molecule to vibrate and re-emit the radiation. So this really causes infrared radiation to become trapped in the atmosphere rather than to be reflected. And so in turn, temperatures rise with increasing CO2. Rising temperatures can really contribute to positive feedback loops, like thawing permafrost. Permafrost below the Arctic oceans holds about 60 billion tons of methane, which on top of CO2 really adds to the greenhouse effect of warming. And the melting of glaciers. Glaciers have a high albedo effect and they reflect more sunlight. And oceans absorb. So more energy and more heat will be trapped on Earth because of this melting. Now, all of this is causing global temperatures to rise fast. Come ride the global temp coaster. Now, there are three key players in the perpetuation of this claim, and it's no surprise that each benefit financially by public denying the connection between CO2 and climate. The first over here is big oil companies like Exxon specifically, and we'll get into a little example after this slide. And we also have electric companies, since the energy in the United States is largely produced from the burning of fossil fuels. And third, we have politically driven think tanks like the Cato Institute, and these are filled with political scientists and economists with, well, the economy in mind, not necessarily the environment. But what all of these institutions have in common is that they've released statements, they've published reports, and they've even administered threats towards scientists connecting anthropogenic CO2 with a rise in global temperature. Now let's get into an example of how they perpetuated this claim. Have you ever had a conversation with a friend who was preoccupied by their phone so they didn't really hear you? Well, imagine your friend is Exxon and they're preoccupied by money. In 1981, Marty Hopper was a scientist working for the oil company Exxon, and he created a climactic model showing that Earth would be significantly warming if we continued burning fossil fuels at the rate that we do and putting this anthropogenic CO2 in the atmosphere. And this was what Exxon was contributing to. So he brought this to his managers, and his managers brought them that information in this model to their overheads, and Exxon decided to take a position. The Exxon position, in their own words, was to emphasize the uncertainty in scientific conclusions regarding the potential enhanced greenhouse effect. So fossil fuel industry really distorted the uncertainty behind scientific connections between CO2 and climate, even the ones their own scientists were making. Now, this position from Exxon hurts a specific population. In fact, to perpetuate the claim that CO2 is little and has no impact on climate is to marginalize communities already facing serious inequities. And according to the NAACP, there are 91 counties across the US that are building oil refineries or where they exist close to more than 6.7 million African Americans. And this disproportionately exposes them to toxic and hazardous emissions like benzene, formaldehyde, sulfur dioxide, and even higher concentrations of CO2. So it's not minuscule. CO2 is not minuscule whatsoever. With it comes these intense respiratory death sentences, and Black communities are experiencing them at much higher rates due to generations of living near these facilities, contributing to poor air quality. And the definition of marginalization is to treat a group as insignificant. So by spreading this claim, we are ignoring the health of minority citizens. Now, to terminate the spread of this claim, we need to start by addressing those who are most heavily impacted by it. And we can fight against the myth that CO2 is minuscule and has no effect on climate by advocating for anti-racist policy. For example, there are proposed limits of CO2 emissions placed on large industry, but reporting these numerical quantities of CO2 is largely voluntary, and that should get you infuriated enough to want to change that. And to conclude, CO2 is not minuscule. It's not a minuscule trace gas whatsoever. It contributes to the warming of climate directly and through positive feedback loops. And we can terminate this claim through anti-racist action. Thank you.